Hey everybody, this is Silver Spook, Christian Miller. This is the Silver Spook podcast. I'm extremely excited to be speaking with Mark Yohalem, creator of Primordia. Mark, you want to go ahead and say a little bit?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer by day and a game story writer by night. The main sort of independent project that I've worked on is Primordia. And then I also worked for hire on Kohan 2, Axis and Allies for Timegate, Heroes of New Earth and Savage 2 for S2 Games, a little bit on Dragon Age Origins for BioWare, and Torment Tides of Numenera for An Exile Studio. And right now, actually really for the past 5 years since Primordia came out, I've been working on a role-playing game called Fallen Gods, which is another independent project that Wormwood Studios is developing.
Awesome. So I guess I can start off just a little bit with how I guess what I'm most familiar with of your work is Primordia, which that was. I mean, I've played a few point and click adventure games over my lifetime, but I wouldn't call myself a fan by any stretch of the imagination until I played Primordia, which was about like 2000 early 20 teens, and I played Primordia, and I was like, I was kind of like, anyone who's listened to this podcast knows I was getting kind of disgruntled generally with games and game development, and then I played Primordia, and it blew my mind. I was just like, I couldn't believe that 3 guys had made this amazing science fictional point-and-click adventure game. The writing was, my jaw hit the floor. I love the art style, was just mind-blowing, and so that's kind of what got me into point-and-click adventure gaming development. I had done like 3D, Unreal Tournament, immersive sim, first-person shooter stuff, but then I got really into it from Primordia. So that's kind of like, So, and I've been kind of stalking Mark around on the RPG Codex, where he contributes fairly regularly, and I just really love Primordia. I'll be interested to hear about other projects you're working on, but I guess the first thing I would ask. I mean, I know a lot. I've read a lot of the interviews, and I've read a lot of your stuff on Primordia, so I'm going to try not to repeat too much. But I guess, what would you say? Like, here's something moving forward. Like, what do you think? Not the challenges, but what do you think the adventure game scene, or what do you think is the best hope of something like Primordia, like an indie game like Primordia? What would be the best way to go about? Do you think adventure games are kind of, I don't want to say over, because that's kind of a thing that happens all the time, but like, what do you think is the best way to go about making a really good indie game like Primordia nowadays? I don't know.
I mean, I think we were really lucky in the time that Primordia came out. If you look at that trio of games that Wajidai Games published, it was Gemini Rue, and then Resonance, and then Primordia. And you sort of compare the sales figures for those games to, just looking at Wajidai Games, the ones that were before and after. It's clear that we sort of hit at this moment when Steam opened up a little bit, but was still a mostly closed sales platform. And so if you could get in through the door, you had the benefit of people not having a lot of choices other than your game. And so it got a lot more attention than games get now. I have no idea how Primordia would do if it were released today. We were fortunate that we had Vic's amazing art, and we had the Wajidai publishing brand behind it, and then that we had this successful greenlight on Steam. But then, I haven't played through it all the way, but like Shardlight is a beautiful game. I gather it's very well written. It's published by Wajidai Games, and I think, it doesn't have the same number of sales. And I think that's not a reflection on the game. I think it's really a reflection on what's happened with the market. If you look, there was a time. I mean, it's a little bit funny because we say like the adventure game genre is dying. But in fact, if you look at point-and-click adventure games for sale on Steam, it's actually possible that there are more for sale right now that have been released in, say, the last 3 years than would have been released in any 3 year span in what we consider the golden age of adventure games. So, the real problem is that how do you get noticed in that mix? And these are games, some of them, maybe mediocre, but, your game and, Milkmaid of the Milky Way is another example of this, where these games with really striking visuals, really engaging ideas, but they're just all sharing the spotlight, and it's hard to get gamers there. Now we have this critical mass with Primordia, where because of this, again, the way Steam works is, you get such and such number of reviews. That means that you get more prominent placement when there's a sale. It means that when new players see their friends playing a game or see that their friends have left a review, it generates additional attention to your game. And so there's basically sort of a rich get richer phenomenon for people who got in back in the day. And whereas now, I don't know. I mean, even Daedalic, which, with Pillars of the Earth, I mean, you have a famous intellectual property. It's not Star Wars, but it's a known intellectual property. You have, professional, Bakshi level animation in the game, and professional voice acting and orchestral music. And I don't know, it sold 1,000 copies or 5,000 copies. So, I mean, it's worrisome. I don't know. This is a very long-winded answer, but you sort of have. There are two ways to look at it. I mean, one way to look at it is, could a guy like you or me have made a point-and-click adventure game in 1990 and sold it commercially? The answer is basically no. The only one that I know of from that era was the Hugo Whodunit series, which was a big inspiration to me. But it's not like they were a dime a dozen. They were extraordinarily rare. So we have these tools and these sales portals that didn't exist in the past. But on the other hand, we have a sort of a shrunken market for adventure games and way more competition. Anyway, so that's just, I don't know. That's not an answer to your question of what I would recommend for people, but that's sort of how I see the space right now.
Oh yeah. No, that's basically what I was looking for. I kind of think that there's not a clear solution at this point. I guess. Yeah, I mean, it is basically like an overcrowding. I mean, that's kind of what I'm hearing. I've talked to some other devs and seen some other people, who have, just the week that Neofeud came out. What was it? Journey Down 3 came out, which it's the third in a fairly well-known series, but and I think it did okay. I don't know that it's done as well as maybe even Primordia had done. I kind of followed it a little bit during the week because it was on. But on top of that, there was I think there was at least a couple other adventure games, and some of them that I didn't know. I don't know the exact numbers, but I believe it's 100 to 200 games per month released on Steam. So yeah, it's basically the spotlight is being split. I mean, you're totally right that the attention is being split between a lot of games, and so yeah, there's a lot of point and clicks, and it's kind of it is a tough tough thing to crack.
I mean, I just looked on Steam Spy, and I mean those figures can be unreliable, but it puts The Journey Down Chapter 3 as having sold 4,400 copies, which, in one way of looking at the world, that's really good. Although a percentage of those are going to be the people who backed it on Kickstarter, and so that wouldn't be additional sales. But you can't support a development company on that number of sales at that price, and so. If you're someone who does it as a hobby in your spare time, it's okay. Although even then, there's the problem that as a hobbyist, part of the pleasure of it is still connecting with players. It's amazing to me to hear from someone like you who says, I played Primordia, made me want to make an adventure game. If I were just making adventure games and there was I was just shouting into the dark and no one was shouting back, I don't know. I'm not sure I would continue doing it. So it is a difficult situation. And I mean, the other thing is just the production values have gotten so good, even among indies. I don't really know what the explanation for that is, but I think your game has really striking visuals, and certainly if it had been released, say, I don't know, 8 years ago, I think people would have said there's never been an adventure game with graphics of this resolution, of this fidelity, of this imagination, the vibrancy of it. But now it doesn't detract from the artistic quality of it, but just the bar has gotten really high in just what people can do with pixel art, what they can do with 3D art. The journey down, I think, is maybe not as good, but it's within the ballpark of Grim Fandango. Stasis, I think, is in the ballpark of Sanitarium, if not better. Ben Chandler's work on the Wajidai game titles is as strong as the Sierra and the LucasArts era work, and so and Daedalic stuff is amazing. I mean, it's like Don Bluth was doing it. So that is also something where it used to be enough. I think part of what got us this initial rush of attention was Vic's art is so impressive, and it's again, it's still impressive today, but the bar has gotten higher, and so that it's now almost an expectation that an indie game will have not only excellent art from a technical standpoint, but something original that people haven't seen before.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely like it's a lot easier to produce almost anything, which is like I know. Like in Unity, I mean, it's almost so is easy that it's that's another issue that's cropped up is people taking just existing the asset flipping thing was a big problem on Steam, which is the ease of getting games out there, and just by sheer numbers trying to. Well, I mean, that's another thing I think is there's the number of games being released, and not all of them. It's gotten better, but there are still a lot of what you call quote unquote fake games coming out that. Which makes people a little bit less. Some users are less trusting of a name that they're not familiar with. So, which again, it leads to the winner take all effect of the big larger indie studios or like a Wajidai or a Daedalic or one. Here's another interesting thing I just heard. Telltale is apparently downsizing. They're just letting go of 25% of their staff. So
yeah,
I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, Telltale is. I've not played any of their games start to finish. I mean, it's an interesting how either you die a hero or you live long enough to be the villain kind of story. That when it was starting out, sort of old school adventure gamers, I think, really had rapturous excitement at the idea that they were going to get the Monkey Island franchise back again, the Sam & Max franchise back again, by people who seem to really care about the intellectual property. And I think that is sort of Telltale's hallmark, in my opinion, is that they treat the intellectual property with absolute love and respect. Flash forward, whatever it's been, 15 years that Telltale has been in business, and I think there's a significant contingency. Certainly you'd find them on the RPG Codex, who basically think that it's just making interactive movies, cashing in on IP, and that they, this company that I think started out being viewed as sort of worthy curators of the legacy of the adventure game genre, now a lot of people, I think, view as exploitative of, the worst impulses of modern adventure gaming. And I don't know. I mean, I haven't played their games enough, but I find that sort of trajectory, which is actually common in the way video game players perceive video game developers, is still kind of sad with respect to Telltale, because I'm old enough to remember how excited we all were when they started out.
Right. Yeah. That's another thing I've been noticing is this kind of. I recently I've been doing a little bit of dabbling in a little bit of video games journalism, but while doing the research for that, I discovered that a lot of devs are, you maybe even encounter this. They're a lot more reticent, or have a lot of. They're a lot more careful about anything that they say, because of the potential for certain. I don't want to name names, but individuals in the games journalism or the YouTube and online community, which which will is looking for things to criticize devs for. Not necessarily, and a lot of these people don't necessarily know exactly, like for example, the fact that something was made with Unity, or any people who don't make games, but will find something to get mad at. Let's say, like Telltale, or any particular dev. So I noticed there's a lot less. There's a lot less people talking about that process itself, and a little bit worried about it. And I've encountered a little bit of this stuff with Neofeud. Some just a lot of people are just trolls, but there's some blowback on the way certain things are depicted on both sides. Some people don't like some of the political angles of things, and so I noticed that, and it's another thought, like what kind of outrage or what kind of a backlash are you going to get from any particular thing that you say, do, publish on the internet, with regard to your games. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed that.
Yeah, no, it's something that I think it's not just a game dev. I think just anyone who now, that the internet has sort of gone from being a frontier where you could escape from who you were in reality to being like a giant dossier that people can use to play gotcha with you. And you don't have to be a game dev to have to worry about not wanting to say something that is going to offend someone and be blown out of context, or dredged up 10 years later, or whatever it is. I'll say, my experience with Primordia is that, barring a few exceptions, I've been amazed at how sort of kind and thoughtful people have been, even negative reviews that we've gotten. And my general sort of posture is, if someone doesn't like the game, I think they're right? Like no one can be wrong about what they like and dislike. And so if someone says, I found Primordia's story boring, and I found its characters unengaging. I mean, those statements can't be refuted. I can't respond to it. No, the story is actually exciting, because if it didn't excite that player, then that reflects on a shortcoming of the game. So, generally my take is, if someone is upset about something in the game, I apologize, try to get them a refund if they can get a refund. Otherwise just say, sorry you didn't like it, and mea culpa. And generally I found people are pretty reasonable. I mean, I think there's some minority of people who want to just fight, but a lot of people who post very negative reviews, it's coming from a place of authenticity and earnestness, which is that they were really excited about your game. They paid some amount of money for it. I mean, games are pretty cheap, but it's still, anytime people put down money for something, it's not trivial. and then they put time into it, they give attention to it, and they don't like it. And they feel like they've been cheated or they've been tricked. Maybe they thought the game was going to be something that it wasn't. And so I don't know. I feel really bad whenever the game does that, and I feel even worse when people are offended by what they think the game's politics are. I don't know. I think I always try, because the world can seem pretty dystopian, to focus on the fact that there are some upsides here too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I will say this, like, as harder as it is, as hard as it may be now relative to when you release Primordia, I would not have even attempted to make Neofeud probably at that time, and I would or in the 90s or even the early 2000s, just because of there wasn't a platform like Steam. Like, even myself, I can get on to, I can get in contact with I don't want to trumpet you too hard. James got mad because I gave him a big head because I called him the master of Cyberpunk. But I do think you're a great writer and creator. And the fact that I could get in touch with you via Twitter, via the internet, generally speaking, and have my own Twitter account, and I could reach a large, not by no stretch of the imagination like a large indie studio audience yet, but I could at least, get some amount of following with my Twitter account, with social media, and get some people to the game. It did, like that. I would have been like, basically I would have had to work for a studio, and I did work for like game studios in the early 2000s, but I would never have attempted. I don't think I would have even attempted an indie game like on the scale of Neofeud and think that I could actually sell it myself until this within the last 5 years or so. It's like that's kind of why I went for it, is because I thought it was possible. So there's definitely upside, is what I'm trying to say about the state we're in. It's not all dystopian.
Yeah.
It's heterotopian is a term I've heard thrown around. So it's like half dystopian, half utopian.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's see what else. Let's see. So I don't know. How about like what you want to talk about? What are you working on like right now? Like
yeah. So my current project is a role-playing game called Fallen Gods. So the idea for it came to me, depending on how you slice it, something like 12 years ago, when I had just so when I was a kid, I guess you can go way back. So when I was a kid, I played these game books called Lone Wolf all the time, and really liked them. And then, I don't know, they were expensive, so I probably played like 3 of them when I was a kid. This is before we had a computer that, I wouldn't have been able to play computer role-playing games anyway. But they were sort of my introduction to single-player role-playing games. Then after law school, I discovered that there was a site called projectaeon.org that had gotten the rights or permission from Joel Deaver, who had made the Lone Wolf games, to digitize all of them so that you could play them on this website. And, while I was bored, I don't know, at work or in the evenings, as before I had kids, I played through a bunch of them. And it was struck by the way in which the games just had a vividness and an immediacy that I felt that computer role-playing games didn't. That computer role-playing games involve so many small choices that you're making all the time. But those choices all felt very incremental, whether it was, advancing a skill level from 98 to 99, or adding 1 to your Paragon points out of 375, or whatever it is. Whereas the Lone Wolf games, by the very nature, they're basically choose your own adventures with some stats, tended to focus on these bigger choices. There were like 10 weapons you could get over the course of 20 books total, and 10 different magic spells. And so all of these things had like a kind of heft to them. I started thinking like, it would be neat to have a role-playing game that incorporated those kinds of mechanics into them. And that was sort of mulling in my mind. And then I came across a board game that had just been released also online for free, that had been around when I was a kid, called Barbarian Prince. A company called Dwarf Star Games had made it, and the guy who was responsible for it, I'm blanking on his name right now. Let me just look it up online. God, I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, Arnold Hendricks. So Arnold Hendrick designed this board game that was basically a single-player proto-computer role-playing game that you played with a board and a game book and little figurines and dice. And then he went on to make the computer role-playing game Darklands, which is this amazing 1990s historical role-playing game set in medieval Germany. And so I had this idea that you could basically take the simple rule set of Barbarian Prince, something like it, and marry that to procedural world generation, which I had just been playing a game called Weird Worlds that was like a space opera game, very simple space opera coffee break game that had procedural generation, and then have these vignettes where rather than doing the extremely thin vignettes that Barbarian Prince had, you would have more robust ones that were like what you would find in Lone Wolf. So anyway, I had this idea back in, say, 2006, maybe it was 2008, and I thought, it would be really cool to make it as a space opera, and I was working with S2 Games at the time, did up this 150-page design doc, and they were really excited, and then they were less excited, and they didn't want to make it anymore. And I then changed jobs and started working on Primordia. And in the interim, Faster Than Light came out. This is an extremely long-winded answer, but Faster Than Light came out and basically preempted the space opera game I was making because it was quite similar. And since then, that whole genre has become extremely crowded with, like, there's Star Commander, The Long Journey Home, Out There, Space Station something. There's a whole bunch of these games that are all basically in that space. So then I thought, I basically gave up on the idea, mostly forgot about it, and then read a book called The Long Ships, which I think is like the best adventure story of all time. And it's about a Viking hero named Orm, which means snake, and his adventures sort of in the classical age of Viking raiders and Iceland's republic and things like that. And I realized I became fascinated with that moment in history, and I realized it would be a really good setting for this game idea I'd had from a long time ago. And so I basically started immersing myself in Norse history, Norse mythology, Scandinavian folklore, Icelandic sagas, other, Anglo-Saxon poetry, basically anything I could get from that era, and designing the game. And so now that really started in earnest in about 2012. And now we're getting close to having something, that I can sort of show publicly. I've shown some of the artwork from it, but basically the gist of the game is it's a procedurally generated world map, and the player character is a god who has been cast out of a quasi Valhalla because there's not enough people worshiping the gods anymore, and so there's not enough faith to sustain them. And some people are getting the short end of the straw, short end of the stick, the short straw, and get thrown out. They get kicked out of Asgard. They go back down to Earth, and you have 90 days in which to prove that you should be let back into the land of the gods, or you become a human forever. Meanwhile, the world has become extreme. The reason why people have lost faith in the gods is that the world is falling to pieces. And so, in some respects, it's a post-apocalyptic, or you might say like mid-apocalyptic fantasy setting, in the way that the Norse mythology is really a mid-apocalyptic setting, because you have the shadow of Ragnarok is hanging over everything that happens. The gods know that they're doomed, but this particular, the player character, is a little bit of a cipher, but basically he's indifferent to what's happening to the world. He just wants to get off the world and back into the land of the gods. And so there's this, I think, some degree of like a tension between the player's impulse and the player character's worldview, because most players, I think, are sort of take a basically decent human being attitude, and part of the power fantasy is being able to make the world a better place. But the Fallen God setting presents a world that is intractably in a bad place, and a protagonist who's not particularly interested in improving it, even if he could. And basically, you have the experience of someone who just wants by hook and crook to get back to his position of power and luxury and comfort, and away from the hell on earth. So that's sort of the basic story premise. And as you go through the world, you can go into dungeons, you can go into towns, and you can go into caves and things like that. And you get these vignettes, which are now have become totally commonplace in role-playing games, so I don't even really have to explain them, but they're like the text adventures and Pillars of Eternity and Torment and Age of Decadence and Faster Than Light, where you get like a graphic, you get some options. They're very short. They're usually one or two choices deep. And the goal I've shot for in the powers that you can have, but you get to use them in pretty exciting ways. I hope they're exciting ways. There are different familiars or fetches, as the game calls them, that the god can have. Those offer you some interesting abilities, and then there are different followers you can get, and so on. So, that's sort of the setup. And where we stand now is, I would say the engine is probably about 90% done. The writing is probably about 50% done. The art is probably about 70% done, and the voice acting is probably about 20% done. And we have some music, but we haven't yet started integrating the music because we don't really know quite how the flow of the game is going to be. So we don't know whether a particular piece of music would be playing for 5 minutes or for 35 seconds. And until we know that, we can't really finalize it. Anyway, so that's the big lay of the land. I don't know if there are any specifics on it you want me to go into a little more.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I guess. So I mean, like generally speaking, well, here's one thing: the engine itself. Let me roll back one more level of tangent. What? So it's you, and is it Victor?
It's a big team, actually.
Oh, it's a big team. Okay.
So it's, I'm doing the writing and design. Below me, I don't know. Below me is not the right word. Really, he's above me. But there's sort of a project factotum, whose name I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce, who's Polish, and his name is Maciej Bogucki. And then there's a painter whose name is Konstantin Lentiai, who's Ukrainian, who does the event illustrations. There's a general sort of sprite pixel artist whose name is Dan Miller, who's an American, although he's just been living in China and Japan. And then the UIs are done by Victor Flug, who's the artist from Primordia. He's also doing the item design and illustrations. Then the voice actor is Jamie Campbell, who's an American. We have like this rune stone that's the main menu that was designed by a German named Cleopatra Matzel. We have like a cultural consultant who's Norwegian who sort of answers. I have endless dumb questions like what kind of trees would you find on a mountainside in this environment. That's actually like some of those questions you would think would be easy to answer on the internet, but it turns out they're really quite difficult because you get too much information, and it's this guy is like the perfect repository. His name is Jostein, and he's sort of interested in pagan Norse religions. He's an outdoors guy, and so he can just answer. He's a historian, so he can just answer all of my sort of cultural questions. And I'm trying to think who else we have. I think that's everyone. Anyway, let me think. Oh, and the composer is Anders Hedenholm, who's Swedish from Uppsala. Uppsala is where the biggest of the old pagan temples was in pre-Christian times, which it just amuses me. So yeah, it's way bigger. And then we have a programmer, Connor Brennan, who's American, he's like totally brilliant. It's absurd that he's working on this project. It's like a part-time thing for him while he's getting a PhD at UPenn in neuroscience, interacting with software design. So basically, he is, will build our AI overlords one day. But meanwhile, he's building the engine for Fallen Gods.
I see. Okay, so it's a lot bigger team. Is that still Wormwood Studios, or is this?
Yeah, I mean it's a little bit like the Wu-Tang Clan. Like there are people affiliated with it. So on Primordia, there were 3 of us, and we split. It was just a third, structure. No one was getting paid a salary. We didn't even anticipate making money on it. On Fallen Gods, people get a salary is not the right word to describe the pittance they're getting paid, but I pay people something for their work, and so they're not like stakeholders in Wormwood Studios, although I think they all have sort of become stakeholders in the game emotionally and creatively. But the other thing is, like, I'm not sure that this is a team that it would be possible for me to keep together forever. I would if I could, but like Dan Miller, the pixel artist, when he started, I think thought of himself as like a pixel artist, and now he's like a fine artist doing residencies around the world and putting on art shows. And so, I hope it's not his last hurrah, because he's a really great pixel artist, but I think he may be going on to bigger and better things, and that's happened with some of the artists. We had a couple other painters involved early on, and they've also gone on to. One of them is now a doctor in Hungary, and the other one runs his own farm. And so, I'm hoping to keep the team together long enough to get the game done, and hoping we can work on more stuff in the future. But I think there's a chance that this will be something where when we get over the finish line, people are going to scatter to the winds, and there may not be another sort of same team, same project.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, it sounds like you got a sizable team for not having a that's over 10 folks. I mean, they're not all full time, but I'm guessing. But that's a pretty large team. So the engine, I mean, I guess the one engine question I had was, is it based on another engine, or is this like a from scratch thing, or?
It's in Unity.
Okay.
For a time, have an engine built in Love 2D, which is like a 2D game engine. But for a variety of reasons, we ended up switching to Unity.
Okay, and this is 2D? It's a 2D game?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So Unity is not great for 2D. it's just not really set up that way, which is why Love seemed like a good option. But Connor is quite good at torturing Unity to do what it needs to do. And the engine, it's funny, like the graphical side of the engine is really quite simple. Nothing is simple in game making, but it's relatively simple. But, there's a fair amount of complexity in how the world generation works and how, the systems interact. So I'll give, a dumb example of how something that should be really easy is a big pain in the neck. If you think about, I don't know if you ever played the old gold box D&D RPGs that SSI made, but typically in them you could go to an inn and there'd be an option to rest, there'd be an option to buy a drink, there'd be an option to gossip, and you could gossip, and sometimes you would get information that was useful about the game world, like someone might say there are orcs hiding to the northwest or something like that. So that's a really easy function to program. I could program it for a game that has a preset world, but it's actually really tricky to program for a game that has a procedurally generated world, and it's particularly tricky for Fallen Gods because Fallen Gods has a generated world but static text, so we can't have it sort of generate new dynamic text to respond to the world generation. So we basically have to figure out a way of how is the gossip system going to interact with the event placement system and convey that information such that you can give some useful information to the player, like you can find such and such famous sword over here. And it turns out that was a really tricky design and coding problem to deal with. And so I'd say that's really where Connor's work is most interesting, is how he's found a way to get all of that to work together.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I've worked in actually, funny enough, I started Neofeud I should say I started it in Shadowrun Returns as a Shadowrun Returns mod. So this is actually a Shadowrun game, and then I went to Unity, and I was using Unity 2D in the beginning, and it was actually a totally kind of a different game. It was going to be this kind of Mega Man crossed with Mario crossed with Fallout, mutant, mutant ghouls and mutant rats in the cyberpunk apocalypse, and that main character running around shooting them, and it was a very different game. But I was I kind of thought about it, and I was like, if I want to do a story that's serious, people are not gonna. It's kind of like the same thing. It's gonna be hard to take a. What is the big quote? I love this quote from John Carmack, the creator, the programmer of Doom. Was it the story is story in games is like the story in a porn movie. It's got to be there, but it's not really that important. And I was I guess in certain, in Doom and in Mario, that might be kind of the case. Get beat up Bowser, save princess. I mean, that's kind of it. But for RPGs and point and clicks, for sure it's different. So but anyways, I guess the tangential way to say that, yeah, Unity is definitely, it was tricky. That's one reason why I jumped to AGS, was having to deal with getting the Unity, which was originally 3D, to twisted, and dealing with I was still dealing with 3D geometry, and I know how to deal with it, but I didn't want to deal with the 3D geometry when I'm having only 2D assets and placement on layers and X. I don't want to have a Z coordinate. I just want to So AGS, I don't want to have to deal with 3D world, and then just having the camera in one position. I just AGS is so simple. It's just you have one. That was kind of the impetus for jumping to AGS, even though it's.
Yeah, it's the classic example of some tools in your kitchen are great because you can use them to do 100 things, like a chef's knife. Then there's some tools in the kitchen that can only do one thing, like an olive pitter, but it's way easier to pit an olive with an olive pitter than a chef's knife. And I kind of feel like Unity is like a chef's knife. I mean, that might actually be too generous to Unity, but for making a point-and-click adventure game, AGS does exactly what you need it to do. That's what it was made to do. And Unity, it's like, yeah, it's one of the things Unity can do, but Unity is basically designed to be able to do 1,000 different things. And so it's way more bloated than you need for an adventure game. And it doesn't have the same precision tools, sort of pre-set up for you the way AGS does.
Yeah, definitely. Although, as I understand it, here's my games journalist hat coming on. James Dearden is now working in Unity using Adventure Creator, which is apparently much easier than vanilla Unity. I mean, in terms of like if you want to make an adventure game. So
yeah, and Milkmaid of the Milky Way was made in Unity, and it looks really great. So I mean, it clearly can be done.
Yeah.
So.
I briefly experimented with Adventure Creator and I've done a little. I have a few things going on right now because of Neofeud's finished, and one of them is I've got a friend who is like, he gave basically. I mean, you have to actually pay for Adventure Creator, and he gave me a free version of it. So I did. The next game that I'm working on, I may port. I have a lot of art assets. I haven't committed like fully to any engine yet, but I may jump to Unity. The main problem with AGS at this point, and Dave Gilbert, he has a little bit of easier time with this with Rajadai Games because he's got his amazing programming wife to handle this kind of stuff. But one problem is that Windows updates, the Windows 10 Creator Update, cause a lot of black screen issues with AGS. Mac and Linux have been tricky of late, I would say.
Yep.
So that's the one drawback of AGS.
No, we have that with Primordia. I mean, Primordia is on an older build of AGS than Neofeud is, I assume. And I mean, look, AGS was I think it was a DOS piece of software initially. And there is still legacy code, as far as I know, from that era. And so, yeah, like Primordia, I would say, a significant percentage of the time, it's not like a huge percentage, but probably like, I don't know, 10% of the time I've spent interacting with the community is dealing with the fact that Logitech mice perform very poorly with AGS running through Steam. Steam Overlay breaks the dialogues in Primordia on some computers, but not all. And then there's like a sound glitch. And then now Windows 10 has just made it so that the default video drivers don't work. And so, a big number of, there have been a number of reviews where we get negative reviews that are just sort of like, I couldn't get the game to run out of the box. I gave up trying, thumbs down.
Yeah, I know that one.
I know that feeling. Like, you paid $10 and the game doesn't run. Like, yeah, we deserve a thumb down. But it's really, my understanding is that the nice thing about AGS is it's always being updated. So I suspect in a year there will be a build that runs just fine on Windows 10. The problem we have is that we're stuck with the old build, and the testing to port it to a new build is more than Wajdi wants to handle, and so we're just getting increasingly incompatible with current computers.
Yeah, I've been working on that, and like I had the same issue. Like I was the black screens. The Linux one is even more difficult to deal with. But I don't know if this will help you at all, but I did discover that I set it by default to windowed mode, which is not ideal because people are like, I want to play it in full screen. I want to use my 50,000p massive amazing monitor, and I don't want to play it in a window. But with the Windows mode, I haven't noticed. I had noticed the number of like thumbs down because of some technical. The first thing you discover is a technical issue. So I noticed that like changing it to default windowed mode, people are there's a couple slightly irritated people, but nobody was like, this game doesn't work. I want a refund.
Right.
So I don't know if that's something that, but I guess Dave, so you guys are working. You kind of have to go through Wajdi to make any kind of changes, right? You can't do it yourself.
No, so we can. I mean, we have. It's a little bit of a sore point, but we have like builds of Primordia that fix known glitches in the game that we can't push out because of the QA process. And it's just, you know, it totally makes sense from a business standpoint, from Wajidai's standpoint. I mean, I think Primordia still sells well, but in part because of the publishing contract we have, and in part just because I think Dave is sort of future oriented, they don't really get that. Wajidai doesn't get that much out of Primordia selling today, and so for them to spend their resources doing QA on a new build of Primordia is really not efficient. And if we break the game though, that like diminishes the Wajidai brand. Like Dave reasonably wants his brand to be that like his games run well, and so you know, his view is like the current build runs fine. You know, you don't have to hit on a 20. Just leave it alone. While he can, so you know, he focuses on Unavowed and his other projects. But from our standpoint, it's like this is our marquee title. Our players have identified glitches that we want to fix. Then we can. And so, anyway, I don't want to belabor the point, but
yeah, I get it. Yeah, it's you're kind of in. I mean, that's one nice thing about, I will say, being a one person team is, you know, I am the judge, jury, and executioner. And if I screw up and I blow my company up, that's my fault. You know, so it's
yeah,
that's one nice thing. I mean, the thing that sucks is you just got to work a lot, but you know, I mean, it's all right. I'm in Hawaii, so I'm like, screw all of you other guys. Yeah, I don't have to retire to Hawaii. I'm already there. So
exactly.
not making tons of money, but I'm there. So, you know, but yeah. Anyways, I mean, that's really interesting to hear. I mean, I've talked to James. I talked to Dave a little bit, and I talked to Ben. What's his Ben Grindislav Games.
Oh yeah, Francisco.
Yeah, Francisco. Yeah, like, and I played actually all of his games, and like Shardlight, as we mentioned earlier, and I played Primordia, I played Shardlight, and I was like, yeah, I thought it was all. I mean, it is true that all the Wajidai games, they're all. It is like he definitely has quality control, a high priority. It's like every one of the games are, you know, I mean, they're not like AAA games, but the quality for a point-and-click adventure is basically at the level. The voice acting, I mean, it's like that's one thing. I was like playing the Wajidai games, and I was like, you know, some of these stories coming out of these games, and the acting and the you know, like, it was like watching a TV series. It was like watching a prestige TV series.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes. So that's something. And I was big into Breaking Bad and all that kind of, you know, watching a lot of Netflix, and I was like, I want to do some of this stuff. So, anyways, yeah, I mean, I guess here's one other thing. I know you mentioned Cyberpunk, so I don't know. I have to ask this of everybody that comes on. This is going to be my new segment. I'm going to come up with a name for it at some point.
Okay.
What's your favorite Cyberpunk movie, game, content, or story, anything? A story, possibly, because I know you're a writer. So
yeah. I mean, it's a little bit hard to know where you draw the limit of what counts as cyberpunk. My entry to the genre was Rise of the Dragon, the Dynamics, however it's pronounced, adventure game from the 90s, which is just a shameless Blade Runner ripoff. But I haven't seen Blade Runner, and so, you know, that's sort of the iconic entry point for me. In terms of, you know, I don't know, like Philip K. Dick's stories aren't really cyberpunk, I don't think.
I would call it proto-cyberpunk, possibly.
Yeah, that's probably right. I mean, I don't know, I like Neil Stephenson stuff. I like Deus Ex. I like the Blade Runner movies. I don't know, what? I mean, I'm now just... I feel like I should have some more exciting answer than that, but I'm sort of drawing a blank on... Yeah, I liked the first Matrix movie a lot, actually. Like, I guess a lot of people liked it. The other ones I didn't like very much, but that movie was pretty great. I
should say, well, because Primordia has a little bit of... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, would you put, like, Brazil in the cyberpunk category?
I mean, like...
I like Brazil. That might.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like Brazil a lot. I mean, it's got a lot of overlap with Cyberpunk. Yeah. Um,
Um, I don't know. I mean, in general, it's a pretty depressing genre. I don't know. Uh, you know, so it's not. I would say it's not sort of my like chosen genre. Um, I don't know. Maybe it seems too close to reality now too. But um, I don't know. What about you? What your? I know you said Deus Ex is your favorite game, but is there another non-game that you think is like the iconic work? Blade Runner.
yeah, I mean, like, yeah, from my perspective, like, yeah, Deus Ex is my favorite game. Like, part of my whole cyberpunk thing is, I don't know, it's just the weird way, kind of the weird, like, way in which I encountered it. The fact that I met this is a story I tell every time, but, I met my wife at the same time that I met William Gibson, the author of Neuromancer, in Vancouver, and I have a close circle of friends that the William Gibson message board, which is an online message board,
Yeah.
that I was a part of for a long period of time, like 6-7 years, and I met her on the Gibson board. We like talked. Have a lot of good friends. Actually, a lot of I think like possibly 50% of the voice actors besides myself. I voice act the two of the main characters, the Carl Cobbin and the robot gangsta dude. But everyone else, I think 50% of them are friends that I met through William Gibson or the William Gibson message board. So a lot of my like personal life and my personal history is wrapped up in that. So like in terms of the writer, William Gibson is.
Yeah, it's got to be him.
Yeah, that's not like, I mean, like I compare all Cyberpunk basically to his early work, like the Sprawl trilogy and Burning Chrome, and that's what I think of as true Cyberpunk. Like I see a lot of kids running around, with this like, oh, look at my neon anime this, and I love Cyberpunk bartending Valhalla. That game is like the #1 Cyberpunk.
Yeah.
If you type Cyberpunk into Steam, it's that Valhalla game, right?
Yeah, right. Steam's
And it's
categories are insane. I mean, Primordia is listed as noir, which is like I don't know what universe it's noir. But...
Yeah, so it's like, but I would say William Gibson, any of his earlier stuff would be like my favorite Cyberpunk stuff, and movies, Blade, definitely Blade Runner. For a lot of reasons. I'm also just a really Scott fan, generally speaking. Like, even like a lot of the things in Neofeud. I mean, the way that I tried to set shots up, I would think about it like in terms of like, if Ridley Scott was making a game, I know like I'm not the most masterful artist on the planet, but in terms of like the composition, I watched a lot of his movies, like Blade Runner, the new one, but also Alien. I love Alien. And so I think of so I kind of think of Ridley Scott as like the Blade Runner is like the cyberpunk film for me. Neuromancer is probably like the cyberpunk book. Deus Ex is like, some people say it's post-cyberpunk because of it's not quite as it doesn't have a dude in a pink mohawk. It's not quite. It's coming from the punks of the society angle. Yeah. It's coming from a law enforcement agent working for the UN or the UNATCO, whatever it was. So it's a slightly different angle on it. But I mean that's kind of and it is depressing. But I think it's my personal about some of my personal life. So the depressing, dark bleakness resonates with my not so sunny experiences. So that's kind of why I don't really think of it as like, oh, it doesn't really depress me as much. It's just like, oh yeah, that's just that's just reality.
This is what I swim in.
Yeah, that's it. So it's like, it's like I actually have a hard time with Star Trek. I mean, I've been watching the Star Trek. I don't know if you watched Discovery, and the first bits of it, I was like, this is like, we're just traveling the universe and helping poor barbaric civilizations out of their barbaricness. Join our great federation of the peaceful, where nobody has to work. We just have all of our needs taken care of, and we just travel and learn and educate ourselves, and we're very and I had a little trouble with some Star Trek because it's like it's it rings a little bit hollow for me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I mean, the problem is it's just too far. Like, a post-scarcity society would not look at all like Star Trek, right? I feel like Ian Banks, other people have sort of taken more. Even I don't know. There's like the Golden Age series too, but that realize like it would fundamentally change human nature to have the resources that they have in that show. You wouldn't be like drinking tea and like sitting in a lazy boy chair. Like it would just Whereas Cyberpunk, I mean, the beauty of Cyberpunk is it's basically like, yeah, of course people are going to be essentially the same as they are now, because the basic like greed and exploitation are just scaled up. Like there's nothing transformative about it. It's just it's just like the same. It's the same corporate behavior, the same troll behavior, or whatever. Just scaled up a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I again, like, I like realism. I mentioned Breaking Bad. Like, I like kind of hard hitting kind of stuff that a lot of times it's darker because reality is unfortunately darker, and it probably helps that I have a Catholic Jesuit dad, and he's super liberal, and he's like always railing on the corporate. Ever since I was like 5 years old, he was like giving me like these like philosophical discussions on like Noam Chomsky. Like, I don't know if you ever seen the movie Captain Fantastic. I don't know if you ever heard of that. It's kind of like that, not in the jungle though, but like we're gonna read Noam Chomsky and just talk about the destruction of the corporate state, and and it's like from the eight. So I mean, I have a lot. The point is, I have a lot of kind of like deep, almost like GFK liberal upbringing, kind of like on top of being born in that kind of situation I was in. So that unique life experience kind of makes Cyberpunk it just kind of fit really well, even though like I haven't been to Japan unfortunately, and I can't afford really fancy implants for myself right now. But it's more about the realism, the speculative fiction, and the realism of the approach, as opposed to having a fun romp in the future kind of deal. So anyway, that's my thing on that. So I mean, I don't want to belabor it too much because I know it's. But I will say, like, Primordia. That's one thing I liked about it was like, it seems like your project that you're working on now is you're calling it kind of it's fantasy, but kind of post or mid-apocalyptic. Primordia also has got some, obviously it's post-apocalyptic things going on. So what do you think? I mean, I don't know. What do you think about the post? Is there something there with you? You seem to kind of like post-apocalyptic scenarios.
I mean, I guess. I mean, I feel like I sort of got into the two games came from different directions, and so it's odd that they ended up sort of in the same place. With part of why Fallen Gods is this fairly dark setting is that in the midst of reading all of the sort of Norseana stuff, I was also reading a bunch of books about sort of current state of the ecology in different parts of the world, and a bunch of books about various anti-colonial revolutions and the Russian Revolution. And I mean, those are two sets of subject matters that make you very depressed about the state of the world, because if you accept as true what environmentalists say about the state of the environment, then you should be really concerned about the state of the environment. And then you think, well, what could be done? Well, it would have to be something revolutionary. And so then you look at the state of what happens post-revolutions, and it's almost always, maybe this is too much politics, but, I think it ends up worse, that it ends up, the people typically who are capable of winning a civil war against a more powerful, oppressive, entrenched, power structure. There's no reason to think that those people would be successful at running a civil society afterwards. And generally they aren't, right? Warlords and civil bureaucrats have like totally different skill sets,
Yeah.
totally different attributes, often very different values. And so, that's sort of part of what Fallen Gods, the backstory of Fallen Gods is that there are these initial sort of nature gods, like the kind of gods that would have been worshipped by sort of Neolithic, late Stone Age human beings, who are then overthrown by human beings who become gods by overthrowing them. And the old gods were really pretty unpleasant beings, especially if you were human. And the new gods were human beings, and so you would think this is a good deal. Now we've got our own people on top, but it's basically a conniving, ruthless warlord and his coterie of friends, who then become king for life, god for life, president for life, and take all the good stuff for themselves, and they go to live in the clouds and leave the world to go to hell. And I don't know. I mean, I think that, unfortunately, barring some exceptions, is what happens post-revolution. And so, I don't know. I mean, I guess I do like, in answer to your question, I hate depressing stories. And I like melancholy stories. And maybe this is a distinction that doesn't actually exist. But to me, a depressing story is one that basically says, the world is terrible, and the only thing you can do is suffer. Because the effort to make the world better is a complete futility, and in fact will only lead to more degradation. Because you will expose yourself to disappointment, to other people taking advantage of your naivety, and so like this is an example. Like this is a Philip Roth novel, or a Darren Aronofsky movie, except for The Wrestler, which is I'll get to in a second. And it's just or like the movie Kids, or that basically say like it's just the whole thing is just hopeless. And that to me is like it's intolerable to believe that. A melancholy story, I'm not a huge fan of Martin Luther as sort of some of his points, but Martin Luther has this saying that I've always found very moving, which is, if I knew that the world was going to end tomorrow, I would plant a tree today. And the message of that, at least my takeaway from that, maybe it means something other than what I take it as, but I take it as like the struggle is the point. The doing of the good. It's not that you think necessarily that you're going to save the world, but you have to behave as if the world could be saved. And so the nice that to me is sort of, and that I mentioned The Wrestler. Like to me, The Wrestler is a very depressing story about the character, but in the end, the character is able to find the wherewithal to do the thing that he loved, and he may die doing it. Guess I should have not spoiled the movie. And likewise in Primordia, to me, Primordia, the world can't be saved. If anyone had a chance of saving it, it was probably Metromind. But nevertheless, I think the appropriate behavior in the face of a world that's going to come to an end is something like Horatio's behavior, which is to say, you still treat people fundamentally with respect. You defend their rights. You will let them into your home, whatever. And so Fallen Gods is a slightly different take on that, which is, part of it is to drive home to the player the wrongfulness of what the protagonist is doing. That all he wants to do is just get at, he doesn't care about the state of the world. He just wants to get back into his bubble, where he can last a little bit longer in a greater state of luxury than anyone else, is supposed to make the player kind of uncomfortable. I still want the player to have fun. But there is some. I don't know. I think there's an advantage to the kind of the apocalyptic setting lays bare that kind of question. I think other people like the apocalyptic setting because everyone thinks that it will actually make things better. And like this is true from the very first apocalyptic stories we have in the Bible, right? Like the flood washes away all the bad people. The world is destroyed, and then Noah gets to repopulate it with his own family who are righteous. And I mean, it doesn't really work out, but that's the premise of it. And a lot of cultures have those kind of flood or destruction stories. The Norse have it, although it may have been a Christian interpolation. And I think if you look at most, particularly in the 50s, the apocalyptic stories, and some of them were overtly racist, but they would basically be this idea that like 90% of the world would die, but the 10% who survive would be this resilient yeoman farmer, nuclear family, and and the world will ultimately be a better place because you will have destroyed all of these corrupt superstructures that have come around. And I think Fallout, frankly, is not that different from that. Fallout has the fantasy that that even though the world has come to an end, maybe you can create a niche in it that's going to be better. And I think some post-apocalyptic settings don't do that. Like The Road clearly doesn't. But I think the kind of mainstream post-apocalyptic stories, that's the fantasy that they're selling. It's like, I don't know if you ever read anything there's a writer named Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he's written about slavery and about the Holocaust, and sort of says like, whenever we read about those things, we assume that we would be like the heroes. If we were slaves, we'd be the slaves who would run away. If we were Jews in the Holocaust, we'd be the Jews who resisted. If we were not, Germans in the Holocaust, we'd be the Germans who helped people escape and things like that. But actually, statistically speaking, we probably would be either the bad guys or the sort of passive victims, because that's how most people are. And I think, the apocalyptic stories reach us the same way, which is that the fact of the matter is, if there was an apocalypse, like, they don't need appellate lawyers in the apocalypse. I would be roasted on a spit and eaten by the cannibals. But when we play Fallout, we kind of think like, yeah, I'd be the rugged guy who fixes up a car and starts the new California Republic, and
with the Mad Max asymmetrical jacket.
Yeah, exactly. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, I hate to say this, but I actually have to jump off. This has been a really fun conversation. I hope we have a chance to do it again at some point, but I should probably call it a night.
Yeah, absolutely. We both. I'm gonna do another segment called "Game Developing with Kids" one day, because I have to tend to some diapers. But anyway, it's Mark and I both. We're raising young, possibly little baby game developers, or not the heterotopia of the future.
Yeah.
It's been amazing talking to you, Mark. Thanks for being on the Silver Spook podcast. If you any final where we can find you, notes.
Wormwoodstudios.com, and then we have Twitter is wwsgames.com, and we have Facebook as Wormwood Studios. I'm really not very good at updating any of those things, but at some point when Fallen Gods is farther along, they'll get more active.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll be sure to be retweeting and sharing that around. And when Primordia gets its update at some point, come on, Dave. we'll also share that around.
All right,
but you can find me at everybody knows where to find me. Just type in Silver Spook and it all shows up. Thanks everybody for listening to this podcast. Have a good night.